name is Namrata. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. This is my first year with Magic, and I am blessed, I would say, to have Chloe. Chloe goes to Marymount School in New York. The best thing about Chloe that I think even I didn't have when I started my science is she's not afraid of asking questions. That was during my entire Magic program, I figured out that she is not afraid to ask any question. That is the best thing. And I think I even heard this from one of other mentor. Like, I invested my entire 1 year, first year in graduate school, reading out the scientific paper to just get the main thing from that paper, or what is the one line or one thing that you want to get out of the paper. I introduced some paper to her and she was like spot on. She will get what she wants from that paper. That was the best part. I was like, I don't know what I was doing when I was your age in high school. You are so determined, so motivated to do science. And I like that part about, I'm so glad that I got Chloe. And in this COVID era, she's enjoying baking. She told me that she's doing lots of baking, which is we are so much foodie in this pandemic. So that's how she's enjoying her pandemic time. And we worked on asthma project, and I got to know so much about asthma, even from her own experience, some of the steps she told me. So it was learning process for me too. So we both taught each other, we both learned from each other. So it was a great experience for me. So let's have Chloe.
Thank you. Okay, so my mentor is Namrata, and she deals a lot with neuro diseases such as Alzheimer's, ALS, and dementia. She has her PhD, and her main objective is what is the underlying cause of these neurodegenerative diseases. So she works at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and she deals with neonatal babies, and she relates epigenetics and the relation with Alzheimer's when they grow older, I guess. And she really wants to see how these two things can be related, something from when you're first born to something when you're 80-something years old. And something that I found really interesting and touching is whatever she does with all her knowledge that she's gained with her PhD is for the good of humankind. So my project. So as Namrata said, my project is with asthma and genetics, and my project during this mentorship is a little different from those that have been presented so far, as it is more of a research-based project. So my presentation to follow will be more about a more overview of what I've learned so far. So I also did a mini experiment, which I'll get to at the end, that shows some of my findings, and I created a hypothesis about asthma and genetics and how the two are related. So I'm very interested in the respiratory system and the respiratory related diseases, but mostly on asthma and the genetics behind asthma and how these two things can be related. So my magical experience. So some highlights that I had was getting to learn a lot about my mentor's work, because I found it so fascinating to get to learn something that I've never even thought about, but something that's so complex, and something that she's also working with two different things like I am with asthma and genetics, and how you can work them both together. And then also working with a professional scientist researcher, because she's brought so much light onto how to read a scientific paper, how to not only things about science, but also how to properly format a presentation, how to describe diagrams to an audience. So that's some of the lessons I learned about how to give an impactful presentation, and also how to analyze and conduct an experiment. So here's my presentation. So the title is The Importance of Genetics in Asthma. So why should you care about asthma? 1 in 13 Americans are living with asthma, which is equivalent to 25 million Americans, and 339 billion people worldwide have asthma. In addition, asthma kills over 3,500 Americans each year, and the total cost of asthma treatments in the US alone is $56 billion annually. Research is saving money. For every $1 invested in an outreach program, $3 are saved in Medicare costs. But yet, asthma is still one of the most overlooked respiratory diseases, but affects people's everyday lives. So the respiratory tract. This is just some background. Since asthma is a respiratory disease, I just wanted to kind of explain what key areas it affects. So as visualized to the diagram to the left, the respiratory tract is comprised of the nasal cavity, pharynx, trachea, and the lungs. And the lungs are made up of bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli, which are those little stem branch-like looking things in the lungs. And the process of respiration is shown to the flow chart to the right, and the process starts with oxygen-rich air from the environment flowing into the nasal cavity, to the pharynx and the trachea, and into the lungs. In the lungs, the oxygen flows through the bronchi and the bronchioles to the alveoli, and at the alveoli, the oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. And then the carbon dioxide then makes its way back through the tract in the reverse order and out into the environment. So if you have any respiratory issues, such as mucus, cough, or an inflamed airway, you may have a respiratory disease. So some of the most common respiratory diseases are chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, also known as COPD, chronic bronchitis, and cystic fibrosis. So COPD is an umbrella term that encompasses several respiratory illnesses, which mainly causes breathlessness or the inability to exhale properly. And chronic bronchitis is a form of COPD that is emphasized by chronic cough and mucus from the lungs. And cystic fibrosis is a genetic respiratory disease, and it's caused by a defective gene that creates a thick and sticky mucus that clogs up the tubes and the passageways. And asthma is defined as a common chronic respiratory condition that causes difficulty breathing due to inflammation of the airways, as seen in the diagram below. So the diagram below shows a normal airway to the left, and then to the right, the middle one and the one all the way to the right shows two asthmatics' airway. And as you can see, it's very, very constricted because of the inflamed airway and the thick layer of mucus that covers it. So you might be wondering why I have such an interest in asthma. So I chose to study asthma because I myself have asthma along with multiple members of my family, and have always been interested in its complexity and the different causes that trigger this disease. All right, so in people with asthma, the airways or the bronchial tubes are inflamed or swollen and produce lots of thick mucus. So as you can see from the diagram to the right, there are some environmentals and genetic factors, but some of the most common ones are environmental cues, mode of birth delivery, use of antibiotics, oxidative stress, exposure to tobacco smoke, and an industrialized lifestyle. So genetics, as I said, I combined with asthma and genetics. So genetics is the study of heredity and the variation of inherited characteristics. Adult onset asthma has a greater genetic component and more shared genetic architecture with more comorbidities than childhood onset asthma. And out of 142 genomes, 123 loci are associated with childhood onset asthma, while only 56 are associated with adult onset asthma. So the importance of genetic in asthma. One thing that I found very, very interesting when I was reading a research paper was that the genes at adult onset loci are more highly expressed in the lung and the spleen, which are immune organs, suggesting that adult onset asthma is a more lung-centered and immune-mediated disease. But in contrast, tissue-specific enrichments of expression of childhood onset asthma point to skin, indicating that the onset of asthma in the childhood results from barrier function defects. So that's something that really explains the difference between two different types of asthma, adult onset asthma and childhood onset asthma. And another thing that I thought was very interesting was the effects of variation at some loci can be ethnically specific and potentially modified by genetic background, which itself differs between populations and with different ancestry. So another slide about the importance of genetics in asthma is that, as seen to the diagram to the right, a substantial portion of genetic risk for asthma is mediated by regulation of gene expression in the immune cells. So as you can see, the airway to the left is very clear and open. It has very little mucus, but the airway to the right is an asthmatic's airway, and it's very closed off because the airway is so inflamed, and it has a lot of mucus, which is shown by that thick layer of green. Also, another positive correlation with eczema was present in childhood onset asthma only, which is an example of a comorbidity that had to do with childhood onset asthma, eczema and asthma. And then a positive correlations were observed between adult onset asthma and obesity-related traits, smoking, arthritis, and insomnia. So as I mentioned before, I did do a small little experiment. So the experiment I performed was, my hypothesis was, if one parent has asthma and the parent has more than one offspring, at least one offspring should have asthma. And if neither parent has asthma, then it is less likely that any offspring will have asthma. So as seen for the table of results down below, families A through C had at least one parent with asthma and one child with asthma, as I predicted. But contrary to my hypothesis, families D and E either had an adult or child with asthma, but not the other, which I thought could be explained by a more distant family member also suffering with asthma. And also in line with my hypothesis, families F through I had no adults with asthma and therefore no children with asthma. And as you can see by the column all the way to the right, even through my extensive research and my experiment, it is still unknown whether this asthma is due to genetics, environmental factors, or a combination of the two. And lastly, we talked a lot about asthma and the genetics behind it, but we didn't really get to talk a lot about the therapies. So the targets for asthma and COPD that these new emerging therapies are really going after is interleukin 5, 4, 13, and 17. So interleukin as a whole, they regulate cell growth and mobility, and particularly important, it stimulates immune responses such as inflammation, so inflammation of the airways having to do with asthma. And some current therapies are inhaled corticosteroids and long-acting anti-mucocarcinics. And some emerging therapies that I read about are, by phenotyping and endotyping patients with asthma and COPD, one can personalize approaches to treatments for those patients who need add-on therapies. So that's kind of really looking at a person's asthma and adding different therapies on top of each other to try and create the perfect therapy. And an example of a comorbidity, again, is asthma and COPD. So that's my MAGIC demo. It's kind of just a quick overview of a bunch of the diagrams that I showed previously, so that's okay, we don't really have to watch that. And I'd like to say thank you to my mentor and to the MAGIC mentorship as a whole to give me this opportunity, and thank you to everybody who participated in my experiment.